I start with this because I ran across this cartoon and it just seemed so appropriate. So here's Chicken Little and the sign guy sitting at the conference table at the Economic Forum. Well, they're not laughing at us now. We have seen a lot of predictions about what was going to happen or what could happen and the types of things that we should or could be ready for, and we weren't necessarily prepared. We will try, I think, in the future to learn from this and be a little bit more prepared. But I heard a really interesting comment from one of the readers of the Business Intelligence Brief earlier today. He was talking to his brother-in-law, who was a fire chief. And the fire chief said, "You know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of fire protection at the turn of the last century. When you were looking in the 1800s, there was no preparation. We knew that there were going to be fires, but there were no fire departments that were publicly funded. Very few. I mean, there's no fire hydrants, no nothing. I mean, little bitty fires would turn into conflagrations that would completely destroy an entire city. It was determined that we really ought to be better prepared. We really ought to have more fire departments. We need to have hydrants. We need to have smoke detectors. We need to have all these things because we know that we're going to be hit by these fires every year. I mean, this is absolutely guaranteed. Same thing with the virus. We know we're going to be dealing with things like this every year because we have been for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. The issue is how do you prepare and what do you do to deal with the situation once you're confronting it? So, a couple of perceptions, since many of the ASA members are manufacturers, there's kind of a misnomer around manufacturing in the US, and you're seeing it play out again now. The media doesn't really quite understand, never really has understood what manufacturing is and what role it plays in the US. You get these assessments and these statistics thrown out, which are in some respects almost misleading. It is indeed the smallest share of GDP since 1947. It makes up around 11% of the GDP. And usually that is presented with breathless concern, like manufacturing is down to 11% of the GDP. No sector of the economy is that large now. Professional services, which is theoretically what this country has become, law, accounting, banking, finance, it's 12.8. Government in its entirety, federal, state, local, everything, 12.3. Almost every slice of the GDP is about the same now. It's a very diverse economy. So seeing manufacturing at 11% is not a sign of concern. It basically means, yeah, it's right up there with pretty much everybody else. We are still the world's second largest manufacturing nation. Only China has larger output, and that's predominantly because of consumer goods. We accounted for around $2 trillion in output, not too shabby in terms of a contribution to world GDP. Employment is always critical. Direct employment in manufacturing is at around 12 million in the US, expected to decline a little bit by the middle of the decade to maybe 11.3. But what's not counted is indirect employment. And one of the things that has become really obvious with manufacturing is that robotics and technology is playing a much bigger role than it used to. So you're doing a lot more productivity with fewer people because you're using more machines. For every person that's working directly in manufacturing on the line, there are 15 jobs that are dependent on that production. When people talk about the level of employment in manufacturing, it's often referred that we don't do a lot with manufacturing. There's not a lot of people working in manufacturing, but it's a classification issue. I mean, if you're working for the Ford Motor Company and you're actually on the line, you are counted as a manufacturing employee. If, however, you're in the front office, you're in accounts receivable, you're in design, if you're in supervision, if you're some other job with Ford, you're not in manufacturing. This would come as a real shock to the person working for Ford, who basically assumes that they're in the business of making cars, at least in some respect or another. Their job is as important as the guy that is putting a part on a chassis. the robotics issue has skewed who was working, who is working, what exactly people's jobs are. The other important thing to note, and this is something that's very relevant to the ASA membership, the vast majority of manufacturers are small businesses. 76% have fewer than 20 employees. The definition of a small business varies. There's a certain amount of unanimity around small being less than 500 employees and revenues or sales of 8 million or less. The Small Business Administration will look at 150 million or less as small business. So there's some wiggle room in terms of what constitutes a small business. But manufacturing in the US is overwhelmingly a small business arrangement. We have seen a slow recovery in global construction, expected to continue into the coming years. Obviously, this has been a down year, but even in the middle of a COVID crisis, you have seen a certain amount of activity, particularly in some of the emerging markets. Those will continue to expand, and the advanced economies will return to a level that was higher than what they saw in 2018 and 2019. It's going to be different kinds of construction. We'll talk a little bit more about this as we go through it today, but probably less in the way of things like office buildings, but more in the way of things like warehousing and more medical activity and more kind of remote activity. Even the office buildings are being built further away from the center city because you have a lot of people now that are working from home and are taking advantage of being able to be further away from the urban area and the congestion. Well, if you end up with a hybrid system where they're working at home part of the day and part of the week and working at an office part of the week, now you end up having office buildings, smaller ones, scattered in exurbs and in the suburbs more than in a central location. One of the things that is good news for ASA is that the sectors that have been affected most by the COVID-19 and the lockdown recession have been not as important to an ASA company. You've seen a lot of impact on things like retail and airlines and tourism and travel. Not that these are not important, because obviously they're using the parts and the assemblies and the plumbing and all the rest that everybody else does. But areas that are a little bit more important to ASA, oil and gas, the automotive logistics, things like that, construction in general, have been to a certain degree insulated, not completely, but there's been more recovery, a little bit more quickly in those sectors than in some of the harder hit ones, particularly retail, tourism, and travel. Again, looking at some of the exposure levels, the high exposure things like apparel, consumer durables, gaming, lodging, and leisure. Some of those are important to ASA members, others not as much. The low exposures have included everything from food and beverage, waste management, packaging, so you can kind of see where the customer base fits. The majority of the ASA customer base is probably in that middle range, and meaning that some companies are going to have been affected by the lockdown pretty dramatically. Others have been a little bit insulated. And it's also become a regional thing. Some parts of the country have experienced a more severe lockdown than others. We are still a small business economy as a country. We are still seeing small business growth even into this year. A lot of the lockdown destruction has been visited on small business too. So it's going to be a little of a balance by the time we get to the end of the year. The estimate at this point is probably around 200,000 small businesses have gone out of business thus far this year. Even in a normal year, you're going to see something like 50 to 100,000 small businesses going out. So we're probably at about double our normal pace in terms of small business closure. And because they're small businesses, there's lots of things that will cause them to close. It's not necessarily that they have lost their markets. It's not necessarily that they have lost their revenue stream. In many cases, it's just simply the fact that the owners, the people that run these companies get tired and just go out. They sell out, they merge, they just simply close doors. One of the issues that was really facing the manufacturing sector, as well as construction and transportation, many others, prior to this session, was the whole problem with continuity. How were companies going to stay in business as their original management, their original ownership got older? We still have those same problems when it comes to finding skilled workers, but the succession issue has not gone away. And it is now, in some respects, accelerated because some of the people that were getting close to retirement anyway kind of looked at the circumstances they're facing now going, I just don't want to deal with this. I was getting close to selling out and getting out of the business anyway. I'm in my 60s, I'm in my 70s. I don't want to try to fight my way through the COVID mess. And so that's part of the reason that we've seen a larger number of businesses going out. We are no longer really expecting a V. Remember early on, I was being confident along with all the other economists. Oh, yeah, we're going to see a V recovery in third quarter, fourth quarter at the latest, because we assumed that once the lockdown was lifted, it would not be reimposed. And we also assumed that the lockdown would be lifted in a pretty orderly manner. We are going back to those ancient times back in April and May when we thought we had figured out we were going to hit peak in April, which indeed we did. And then that was going to lead to a May rebound. Everybody was going to reopen, and it was only a matter of time before life returned to normal. And then May came and went, and June came and went, and now July has come and went, and we're still locked down. We're not as locked down as we were before, but big swaths of the economy are still closed. We now have lockdown in many of the more populated states, and suddenly that V recovery is now a more distant dream. And what we're looking now for is some kind of beginning to a recovery by the end of this year, but it probably won't be in earnest until 2021. I mean, we're looking for probably 30, 40% drop for 2020, something in that range. We've seen a 30% drop in quarter three. By the time we get into 2021, we may see growth back around the 2.5, 2.7 range, possibly faster. It kind of depends on how quickly a lot of these companies resume. There have been good news reports. Consumers have been willing to buy again if they're given an opportunity, but we'll have to see how that plays out when we get this season. This will probably be the most watched holiday season in decades because it's going to be a real what people can produce and what the consumer's mood is going to be. So our next slide, if it will go there. Well, all my efforts. Here we go. Still resisting my efforts. Come on. Isn't technology grand? What did we ever do without it? Life was simple. Here we go. We're on to the next couple of slides. So it's throwing them at me fast and furious now. I don't want them all at once. So, joys of tech. Here we go. Well, I'm going to talk through a couple of these slides because they've taken on a mind of their own. The supply chain issue was something I brought up once or twice before, and it continues to be an area of concern because it's changing, and we know it's changing. We know that we're now getting things from all over the world, not necessarily just from China. We know that we are grappling with how we now do business with places that we never really did that much business with before. The Vietnams, the Thailands, the Indias of the world. It's not that we didn't do business there, but we didn't do it with the volume that we do now. And the advantage that China always had was infrastructure. It was the ability to handle that amount of activity. So the ports were good, the rail lines were good, the highways were good, and in many of the countries we're now working with. It's not that we're unable to get the materials that we need, but it's harder to get them out of India. It's harder to get them out of Vietnam. It's harder to get them out of even Latin America. So the supply chain will continue to alter and adopt a more heavy inventory strategy, which we'll talk about in some detail. This is a way to protect yourself. You've got your own supply chain. You are going back to the days of warehousing, but that can be expensive. We're also still, as I mentioned, dealing with, as we are confronting the new world of training, it's fairly common now for people to say, oh, well, you know, and all that'll be fine. You can't train these things online. I mean, these are the kinds of jobs that require in-person activity. It requires hands-on. And frankly, for a great many people in the United States, their learning style in education. I mean, what you're dealing with right this very second is online education. This is what kids and grade school kids and everybody is going to be dealing with all this coming fall, is some talking head on a camera and maybe some videos here and there. And given our experience with technology, it's going to work sometime. Talking about people who are of the population, they learn with their hands, and you don't do that online. Interact with the tools and the machines and the products, which is a lot of what goes on. So we're going to be dealing a lot with trying to figure out how you increase people's skill level. We have millions and millions of people out of work to get hired. We've seen tremendous loss of jobs in the service sector, in hospitality and travel and tourism and food service. That does not mean that they can just pick up and say, well, you know, I used to work for a fast food joint, and well, now I'm going to install complicated. Really? With what sort of training? I'm going to be installing pipelines in the oil sector now. What did you do before? Well, I worked in a hotel. Okay, it just is going to be a hard transition under the most ideal. All right, I'm going to see if we can get actually one slide move rather than many. It just, there we go. Shopping behaviors have been affected. There goes again. So I'll have to, that's all I had to say. It was great. We are dealing with the fact that consumers are changing. We knew they were changing before, and I've talked about this before. The online option was already making tremendous inroads, but it is now going to be more dramatic. People are more and more dependent on the online option, and it's changing people's expectations. And as I mentioned before, the most vulnerable parts of the retail environment have been the malls, the big department stores, the big box stores, because their go-to-market strategy was literally the same as what Amazon strategy is. They offered variety and simplicity. You know, prior to the advent of the mall and the big box and all that, I mean, you go back quite a while, back to, you know, probably 50, 80, 60 years ago, people would have to go to a number of stores in order to get what they want. And then the whole idea was let's concentrate it in one place. And that was the idea behind everything from the Sears catalog to Walmart. Now it's Amazon. You cannot beat a distribution system that literally has everything. You go on to no matter what it is you want, it's there. Now we're seeing the rise of the smaller store again, where people are beginning to look to that smaller store for expertise. But these are by definition tiny businesses. They are mom and pops. They are small and they're not likely to be as concentrated as they once were, plus the fact that they will take advantage of online as well. So you have a specialty shop that also has an online presence and can sell both in terms of the online experience and to individuals. That's going to be a much more prevalent trend. It's going to be interesting in terms of how it affects people's shopping habits, and we'll just have to wait to see if people return to the shopping experience as entertainment. That's always been one of the drivers of going shopping. You're going to get, and there's a lot of gender difference too. I mean, this is not meant to disparage either men or women, but they shop. You know, the men tend to shop like commandos. They run into a place, they get what they want, they bolt out of the place like they're on fire. So the sooner it can be made, the better. Now, there are exceptions to that rule. And one of the things that I've long pointed out is that men shop like that. You put them in a hardware store, and suddenly they're browsers, particularly in the tool section. You know, they're just, wow, I really want one of those table saws. I don't know why. I don't make anything, but I want one. Women in general tend to shop more for the experience. They also want to see more variety. So they're going to be a more care, more time sensitive shopper, and they don't tend to run in and out on a mission. So as we how it's going to respond to the changes that have come with COVID-19, it's going to be a difference between how the men and women are approached. So just we've hit on some of this already. A lot more robotic use, a lot more emphasis on social distancing, because that's one way to get around the new restrictions. If you are not supposed to have people in close proximity, if there's going to be distance, you begin to use robots and they have very aggressively to using touchscreens as an ordering system. So rather than talk to the person at the counter and tell them what you wanted, you keyed it in yourself. You had a touchscreen. This was a way to reduce the amount of investment in employees and frontline. It made you responsible for, instead of somebody else, and it simplified many of the operations for the restaurant. Well, now that's going to be really taken because it removes another one of those interactions that we're supposed to be avoiding. A lot more use of robots in the medical profession. Robots will be used increasingly to replace workers in the manufacturing environment. The skill shortage has really accelerate, because if you can't find people who know how to do these things anyway, you might as well invest in technology. We're seeing a lot more use of artificial intelligence, more use of cobots, machines that are really designed to work almost as an integrated part of a human being, and that puts a lot more expertise. All right, so here we go, trying to slides move. Well, I have no idea why this is. There we go. So, oh darn, that was a good cartoon. You wanted to see that one. I am not sure why the slides are just not behaving today at all. So, Here we go. So you got to have your humor in here. I mean, it took me a long time to find this cartoon. The future of the company picnic, robots and people interacting. So there you go. Long setup for a quick joke. And now we'll see if we can go on to the next slide. Man, this is just not behaving at all. Here we go. So the dwindling, wow, I do not understand quite why this is not behaving.
Chris, would it be because
Just a
of the
suggestion, Jenner, you should, if you want to take control of this, and I'll just tell you, it's not not responding to me at all. So I can't get him to move. So
Jen, do you have
so
control?
it's just leaping all over the place, completely on its own. I don't mean to be
Sorry, which slide were
throwing
we on?
people. If we can go to slide 23, that would be grand. And then we'll just kind of take
Okay,
it from there.
I'll keep moving them from here.
All right, thanks. All right, so we saw the cartoon. Now slide 24, and I think we should be caught up. All right, very good. So we're where we're supposed to be theoretically. There has been a major concern around the world anyway for us. This has been hitting Japan hard, it's been hitting Korea hard. Europe is kind of right behind, and we're not far off. So the use of robots and the use of technology to replace people was already accelerating just simply because of demographics. About 15% of the US population is over the age of 60. Around 30% of the Japanese population is over the age of 60. So you definitely have countries that are facing that age issue when it comes to workforce, and it's going to become an issue in the US almost regardless of from this point forward. Next slide, please. So some trends in government. We've seen a lot of this already, and it's not particularly unusual. I mean, political division has been an issue for a long time, and not just for us, for everybody. So there are times when you really want the government and the country as a whole to kind of rally around something, and the challenge is getting people into that frame of mind. Right at the moment, we're not there. The country is very split in terms of how to respond to the pandemic because, frankly, the pandemic is hitting people differently. If there is somebody in your family who is sick with this, well, then COVID 19 becomes the number one concern. If you're of a certain age, if you are in a vulnerable category, for others, they're looking at this like, my God, the economy is being destroyed over this. You know, we can't keep it up. So there's very heartfelt divisions between where people want to be. And the fact that this is taking place in an election year makes it even more politicized. The next phase of this is going to be distributing the vaccine. And that's going to be controversial in its own right. We keep looking at the vaccine as kind of the saving moment, but it's not going to be instantly available. It's going to take months before this gets distributed. And there is going to be discussion as to who gets it first and under what circumstances want to be vaccinated and who are going to be opposed to the whole idea, who will continue to be carriers. We know that vaccine 100% reliable even under the best of circumstances. So all of these issues are still going to be dealt with even as we get to the vaccine stage. We've talked about debt and deficit before. It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. The issue is debt service. It's not that we can't borrow money. We can do that forever. But the debt service now is 400 billion a year, if not more. Look for in the future, in the not very distant future, more in services and revenue enhancements, our favorite way of saying taxes. They are likely to be sneaky. There are going to be increases in traditional taxes, but begin to see all kinds of user fees and specific taxes, specific behaviors, things that we already have now but are likely to accelerate. Taxes on gasoline, taxes on certain products, on certain use of certain things. It's going to be very, very common because the country as a whole has really spent way past its ability to service that debt. We'll continue to see power devolving. States are going to continue to play a much bigger role, and we're going to see changes in trade policy. Next slide, please. So there's the debt. As you can see, it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger and is not likely to change direction anytime soon. It has accelerated pretty dramatically. I mean, only in 2012, it's 16 trillion. I mean, it's $10 trillion bigger in just that number of years. We're adding to it at a record pace. We've never seen numbers accumulate this fast. And at some point, it has to reverse. And that reversal process is not going to be fun. Next slide, please. So we talked about this once before too. The only good news that's in place when it comes to the debt is that we don't owe as much to other countries as we used to. The majority of our debt now is held by people in the U.S. themselves or actually by the government. The largest share of the national debt is owned either by the government or the Fed, which is 11%. So between the two of them, you're talking getting close to half. So the foreign share is down to around 30%. It has been in the past as high as 40%. So next slide. Okay, now the capital and lending markets, we've seen these trends evolve over time. They're to a certain degree a little new because of many of these problems have been in place before. The high levels of public sector debt are only met by high levels of corporate. So it's not just that the government is paying a great deal in the way of debt service, so are people and so are companies. Market has been really, really wide open for debt the last several years because interest rates have been low. So a lot of companies have been able to go out and borrow money. The economy was growing, interest rates were low. Why not? Yeah, and then all of a sudden the economy is not growing. Fortunately, interest rates are still low, but at some point they begin to come back up, not anytime soon, and then the pressure begins to build on both the corporate and consumer communities. Consumer debt is not yet to where it was when we had the last recession in 2008, 2009, but it's a lot higher than it has later period. Banks are now having to figure out how to implement government programs, which change almost daily. They're also trying to lend in a depressed environment. They don't know who they can lend to or under what circumstances. Nobody's balance sheet looks really good right now, so the banks are somewhat inhibited. But one of the things that we'll talk about that indicates good news is trade credit. We'll get to that in just a minute. There has been some remarkable recovery in some fairly critical areas. The markets are continuing to be volatile. What else is new? And now you're going to be dealing with companies, both from a bank and from a trade credit perspective, that have blemishes on their balance sheets. Next slide, please. So here's the good news. This is the Credit Managers Index. And I've talked about this before, but the really interesting stuff because the credit managers are the trade credit people. They're the ones who are determining what kinds of terms people are going to get if they are buying inventory or buying machines, which is a lot of what happens with the ASA members. So it's going to be the credit manager who's telling you you've got 60 days to pay, 90 days to pay, 120, whatever. Credit managers have a tendency to think into the future. They are really more concerned about where you're going to be than where you are now. Will you have the money to pay them when you are required to? So if they give you 120-day terms, they're looking at 120 days. They're looking at 180 days. We saw absolute catastrophe in April and March. Those were record bad months. We had not seen numbers that low in decades. But the last set of numbers that we just got, I mean, I just did this 2 days ago. We saw numbers, particularly in what we call the favorable factors, that we have not seen and I mean good numbers. We saw, as I mentioned before, we're just like the purchasing managers index. Anything over 50 is expansion, anything under 50 is contraction. We had numbers that were in the 40s in May, so things were getting a little closer to normal. Got back into the 50s in June. In July, they jumped back into the 60s, which is really, really good, at least for the favorable factors. And the favorables are things like sales, applications for credit, dollar collections, and the amount of credit extended. Those are the things that make credit managers happy. The unfavorables moved a little bit, but not as dramatically as the favorables. These are things like bankruptcies and disputes and accounts out for collection and slow pays and rejections of credit. So a lot of the credit managers are starting to see some distress with some of their customers, but a lot of the others, they're seeing growth. And they're seeing growth by the end of the year because right now, the credit manager is looking towards fourth quarter, if not first quarter of next year. So they're looking ahead and they're concluding here early into next year, we would be seeing a pretty substantial recovery. So that's your good news moment for the day. Take it for what you can at this stage. Next slide, slide 30. Education and training, we've hit on this a little bit already. There's not a lot that can be done online. Schools are going to have to figure out how they accommodate this new environment, and it's going to be almost more the parents that are going to have to figure out how to deal with this. The most likely impact as far as the workforce is concerned is going to be on women. Women will be essentially expected to handle those family responsibilities. So if the kids are home all day and they're now supposed to be educated online and all this stuff, well, that's going to be the woman's job more often than not, which is going to put a real strain on their ability to continue working because it's not like they can be working in their home office and say, ignore the kids for 6 or 8 hours a day. So the advances that women were making in a lot of sectors may start to stall. The students are not going to get the full impact of education. I know that people are extolling the virtue of online learning and all that sort of stuff. They have no choice but to do that. But I used to be a professor, and I'll tell you what, this is the least important part of education. Sitting and listening to the sage on the stage is not effective for more than 20–25% of the learners. Most people learn in different ways. There are the kinetic learners we talked about before, but there are social learners and people that learn by helping educate others. And there are those that learn more through experience and reading, all kinds of different things. Most importantly, we learn from each other. And when we don't have contact with each other, we're not learning. And students are going to basically be deprived of each other. They're going to be deprived of being able to really interact with their teachers and professors. And that's hard to make up for. I mean, even the experience that associations are having, I know that the members of ASA are as frustrated as the members of any other organization I work with. The reason you went to meetings, partly it was to listen to the wonderful news that people like me would provide. I mean, gosh, why wouldn't you want to go to a meeting? You go to the meeting to talk to each other. You go to the meeting to network. You go to the meeting so that you can talk to somebody who's in the same business as you and figure out what they did to deal with the problem. That's hard to do in an online environment. So we're going to have a lot of adjusting to deal with as far as this new environment. Next slide, please, number 31. We also know that education plays a huge role as far as income. And one of the things I want to call special attention to is the idea of earnings by week, according to educational attainment. Those who are making less than $500 or around $500 a week are those that have less than a high school education. This plays into the issue right now of how much money people should be getting in terms of unemployment. There are people who would rather stay on the government largesse than go back to work. And this is part of the reason why. If they are making less than that anyway, why would they go back to work? The people who are more educated are obviously making more money. I mean, by the time you get to people with professional degree, I mean, their weekly take home adds up to over $100,000 a year. The people who are most likely to go back to work in this environment are those that stand to make more money when they go back to work and have the opportunity for promotions and raises and skill building. Those that are not going back to work are what we refer to as transactional employees. They are motivated by one thing, the hourly or daily wage. They don't have any expectations for the future. They are not expecting raises, promotions, skill building. If the guy across the street offers them 25 cents more a week, they will quit you and go to work for him in a heartbeat. That's what they're motivated by. They don't have a future orientation. Right now, they're making $600 a week plus what they would normally get from unemployment. Why go back to work? And many of them will resist until the opportunity is no longer there. So it's kind of an issue of who's most vulnerable and at what point do you consider kind of weaning people off that support. The challenge from the business community's perspective is that as those people see their wages reduced or their income reduced, they stop being able to pay their bills. Rent becomes a problem, mortgages are not paid, credit cards are not paid. So eventually that becomes a business issue as well as a consumer issue. Next slide, please, and then we'll start to wind this up. So the online meeting, this is truer than we would like to admit. When there is a video, we have to look presentable. When there isn't a video, then we can go any way we like. And the fun part is when you get into a Zoom call where somebody has not been aware they were going to be on camera. And it's kind of like, oh my, we're learning so much more about you than we thought we ever would. Next slide, and we'll wind this up and take questions. What does Armada do exactly for any of those who want to continue to stay in touch? We do a lot of writing. Many of you are already subscribers to the Business Intelligence Brief because it's free every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Just send me an email. I'll be glad to put you on the list. And this was always my favorite response to a question given to students. Find X. Here it is. You almost wanted to give the kid points, but not really. We'll now take questions, and I think Jen's going to collect them and then fire them at me.
Yep. Thank you, Chris. That was great information and highly entertaining as well. I apologize to the attendees for the wavering of the slides, and the sound was also phasing in and out, actually. Next time, I believe we should just put the camera on for Q&A. Maybe that was eating some of the bandwidth. Before we end, I would like to thank our 2020 supplier partners who have always supported the positive development of the PHCP and industrial mechanical PVF industry through ASA. When making key decisions in your business, please consider these corporate partners that go above and beyond with their support to advance the association's efforts, programs, and services through advocacy, education, networking, and BI. We will now be taking questions. Post your questions in the question box. Jen will be reading them out to Chris. We will try our best to get to as many questions as possible. And as always, I will be sending out a satisfaction survey to all the attendees. Please fill it out as your feedback is highly valuable to us. And we'll also be sending you an email to let you know that the presentation slides and the webinar recording is available. Okay, we're waiting for questions now. Jen, over to you.
All right, I've got a couple coming in. The first one is, with respect to the vaccine, are you tracking any metrics or have projections related to increased spending in the pharma market in the U.S.?
Yeah, so far the tracking on the vaccine has been a little uneven because a lot of it is being developed outside the United States. So we're trying to kind of figure out who's winning the race between the US, Britain, Germany, Japan. Estimates now are that a final trial is underway with both the US, Britain, and Germany. Japan apparently is another week or two away. If the final trial period is the way it normally is, the vaccine would be at a point of at least partial distribution and testing by September, maybe late August. If that is the case and it continues to play out as expected, it would start to be distributed in October, September of this year. So we're right now at a stage, at least according to the scientists, that it's kind of the moment of truth. We're in the final stage of testing, then it will start being distributed. I think the issue, and from what I've been able to gather, and again, I'm not an epidemiologist, they know that the vaccine will work. They want to make sure that there are no side effects that are even worse than the disease, because as we all know, a vaccine is basically introducing a dead version of the virus into the body. The body then reacts and creates antibodies to fight the virus. The flu vaccine, all of them are the same, and you just have to be sure that introducing the dead virus doesn't somehow overload the immune system, and that's above my pay grade. So that's where we are as far as I know.
All right. I have another one. I've been hearing rumblings about the extra $600 unemployment being asked to be paid back to the states. Is this a true phenomenon or speculation? Have you heard anything regarding this?
Yeah, there's no provision right now for any of the money to be paid back. The only real change is trying to figure out if there is a better system than a flat $600 per week. The proposal that's coming out of the Senate right now is basically going to be a percentage of your prior wages. So instead of a flat 600 bucks regardless, you'd be getting a percentage of what you made before. The idea being that we're not trying to replace your previous job with a better income. We're trying to keep you about where you were before. Ideally, around the world, that has usually been the goal. We have a much more clumsy system than is often the case. The Germans have always had this Kurzarbeit system, which basically, when there's a problem like this, the government pays half your wages and your company pays half your wages. Well, your wages don't change in the least. You are going to get the same amount tomorrow that you got yesterday. It's just that in times of economic crisis, the government steps in and helps the company by picking up half that wage. But for the employee, nothing changed. If you were making 500 bucks a week, you're still making 500 bucks a week. If you were making 2,000 bucks a week, you're still making 2,000 bucks a week. So our system is a little more clumsy because people who were making very little money made more. People who were making more are like, okay, well, thanks for the 600, but that isn't even close to what I was making before.
All right. Any forecast for oil and gas demand in 2021?
Yeah, it should recover fairly nicely, but the two things that are going to be watched most carefully, you will definitely see a recovery when it comes to transportation by car, truck, etc. Two sectors that we're going to be watched will be ocean cargo and air travel. Those are two huge consumers of oil right now. Ocean shipping consumes more than any single sector in the world. That has been severely constrained by the crisis. You've got ships that are stuck in ports, and you've got sailors that are in quarantine, and something like 40% of global cargo has been stalled, and those ships are not consuming. The airline industry has dramatically reduced the amount of purchasing that it has done because it's not flying as much. And if it is flying, it's flying airplanes that are not nearly as heavy as they were, et cetera. So we'll be watching those two closely. The expectation is that oil prices will probably stay roughly where they are now in the 40s, maybe low 50s. That consumption in the consumer sector will be back to normal, if not even a little bit higher, because people are now actually turning to their automobiles as entertainment. Not a lot else to do, might as well go for a drive. But there's going to be concern on the transportation freight sector.
All right. Any word on PPP2 loans for businesses?
Not specifically. We're trying to kind of get to some of those numbers, and it's, I guess, early days yet. We're still getting more anecdotal information than we're getting information that we can really extrapolate much from. It's depending a lot on how the construction sector is adapting to the new demands, because some areas are growing, others are shrinking. Many of the projections they made about everything from office space to residential housing have changed, but at the other hand, they've seen expansion in new areas, medical and warehousing. So that's something that we're trying to watch carefully, and kind of as a, I guess, a preview of things to come. We'll definitely be writing about that in the next issue of the Advisor, which will be coming out probably 2 weeks, 3 weeks from now, because we're starting to get a little bit more of that data.
Okay. Any new developments on the second stimulus check?
Probably there will be them, but we're not sure how much. The idea is that they will come out a lot faster. The IRS apparently is a lot better prepared to distribute than it was before. The Senate version differs from the House version really just in amount more than the concept itself. So something is going to come out in terms of that check, but it's just not clear at this point what the actual number will be.
All right. If I'm not mistaken, in your first or second session, you said that once we realize COVID will probably not kill us, it's just a bad case of the flu, everything will ramp back up. Do you still have this kind of optimism?
Yeah, there still is a real kind of three-stage concern, and the polls continue to indicate that people will be less worried about the virus if there is not a fatality rate connected to it. There has been a constant battle as to what you report, because you get people saying, well, the number of infections went up. Well, frankly, no one cares, because you've got 65% of people who don't get any symptoms at all. So who cares if they're infected or not, except that they're carriers? Then the issue becomes hospitalizations. We worry about hospitalizations because the medical sector is going to get overwhelmed. But the hospitals come back and say, well, of the people that are hospitalized, we are seeing recovery for about 80, 90% of them. So then it comes down to fatalities. And if the fatality rate goes down, in other words, if there is an effective treatment where people can then have the attitude that, okay, if I get sick, and I don't want to get sick, but if I get sick, I'm going to survive, and there's good treatments, and I'll be fine. Then people start to worry a lot less about infections, and then you start having a kind of a loosening of the lockdown. Right now, the issue is that, well, 2 to 3% of the population is still vulnerable. The fatality rate is about 2.2, 2.3. And in the United States, that's potentially 3 million deaths. And that's too high. So at this stage, get a treatment that works, get a vaccine, and life theoretically returns to normal.
All right, looks like I've got two more. Ultimately, how much manufacturing will return to the U.S. versus China?
Probably the return to the US will depend on three things. One is the company that is moving back to the US substituting technology for labor. The appeal in China or India or Vietnam, anywhere else, is that if you have a labor intensive business that really is not competitive in the US, you have to move somewhere else. So if the company is in a position to substitute technology and robotics for people, then it can move back to the US. Number two is going to be infrastructure. The advantage China has always had is not just that it's a low cost production place, it had the infrastructure to support this kind of export activity. Other countries don't. So if the company that is trying to shift from China can find the infrastructure to support what they want to bring out and into the US, they can confidently leave China. And then the third one is really going to be more probably political and strategic. China is getting harder to work with, mostly because of the tariff and trade laws that have been passed and will continue to be passed. We are likely to be heading into a pretty protectionist period of time, as will everybody else. Everyone's concern is going to be their own domestic economy. So we are going to have a bias towards our own production, and so will everybody else. So it'll be harder for us to sell into other countries. It'll be harder for other countries to sell into us. And that's going to make it more dramatically strategically important to produce locally. Part of the whole idea of warehousing and keeping a lot more inventory close to home.
All right, and do we have a GDP forecast for 2021?
Right now, the GDP growth numbers are pretty speculative going out that far, but the consensus, as much as there is one, will be that we'll see growth between 2.2 and 2.8% for the year. We are likely to see a little bit faster growth in the very beginning, depending on whether or not we can get out of the lockdown. If we assume that by the end of this year, we are closer to a vaccine, we are closer to better treatment, the lockdown can be really lifted, we could see growth in first quarter, second quarter of next year, 3.5, even 4%. But then it will slow down, and that initial rush will be replaced with a more traditional growth between 2 and 2.5. So long term for the entire year, somewhere in that 2.2 to 2.6 range.